Can you all hear me on? Oh, maybe they're getting dinner or something. Went to the bathroom. So I think we will go ahead and begin. We have a slightly smaller class tonight.
Should I just pay?
Okay.
Yes.
Hi Daryl, hi Sherry, come on in.
We're getting there.
No worries.
How are you doing? Favorite.
Well, welcome.
Taco Bell.
Ah.
Second favorite.
Well,
Exciting.
Very good.
well, he wrote there again, we have.
He who spills it cleans it.
So, during Hanukkah or during Thanksgiving?
During the week.
During the week, okay, so Jay just asked if we're having class during the week of Hanukkah. My plan is yes to have class during the week of Hanukkah. My plan is not to have class next week during the week of Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Hanukkah is Hanukkah, so we can make it.
But we're gone the week after.
But the week after that, Jenna and I and Liana are going to be out of town. So the following week, we will not be home.
Thanksgiving?
Next week is Thanksgiving, yes, so do not come next week.
It's early this year. It's early. It's on the Jewish calendar.
So since everybody is here, before we begin, I want to, on behalf of everybody, wish Sarah a very, very, very happy birthday. Happy birthday, Sarah. Can we sing?
1, 2, 3. Happy birthday
Happy birthday
to you. Happy birthday, dear Sarah. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, man, I'm sorry online for that toneless, this toneless howling choir. All right, good to see everybody. So let's go ahead and begin. We left off last week talking about representations of Exodus. And I'm gonna go through at least one more that's familiar to us. But I just want to sort of impress upon us the point that Exodus really is all about representation. Not representation necessarily in how we use it in a modern, like, colloquial sense of, like, you know, we're seeking representation for a group or an identity or something like that. Although Exodus does speak to that as well. But in the sense that this is, I want to say, really the most reproduced myth and mythic narrative in, at the very least, Western culture. I hesitate to say globally, but definitely in Western culture. We could, I guess, say that maybe the hero's journey is as reproduced as Exodus is. But Exodus is really, really high up there, and certainly is important to all of us. So when we're talking about Exodus, we got to remember that we are talking about, in pretty much any context, we're talking about a representation of whatever those actual events were. And because Exodus is created as a representation, that's why it has a sort of salience and resonance with so many different people across so many different historic eras. And that's what these images are right here. These are representations of Exodus, both Chagall's crucifixes, which are more semi-modern ones, and then of course the Shirat Hayam in the Torah itself, which is a very, very early representation of Exodus, a pictorial, visual representation of the crossing of the sea. That's a representation of Exodus. So this next one you're also familiar with. Let's see. Come on, screen, go forward. Then this always happens when my helper gets, whether it's Hillary or Jenna or Sarah. Okay. Right? Hold on. Yeah, I clicked on it. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So
You started moving.
got it. So visual representation, and yes, I know it's bread. And the reason that the bread is in that particular image is because when I made this slide and then clicked on the little like slide designer tab, what came up in this slide about Passover was a bunch of bread. And I thought that was just so funny and just like it just that was delightful. It was delightfully absurd, and in many ways a perfect representation of what it is to be Jewish in a non-Jewish society. That is the first image that came up, and so rather than like taking that image out, and putting an image of a bunch of people around a Seder table or a pile of matzah, I thought I would keep that bread there. So yes, the education director does know that there's bread there. So I'm not gonna go over all of this. You know what this is. We celebrate it every year. This is for my college students. But I do want you to think of the Seder also as a representation of Exodus. We sort of know that instinctively because we tell the story as if we were there, right? But nevertheless, this is another sort of incarnation of this sort of this way of thinking about the story. Whenever we engage with Exodus, we create a representation of it, and the Seder is no different. Now I'm going to skip the next couple slides because I don't want to get bogged down in this theory.
Donnie, I'm in a lecture right now. Can I call you after?
Faith, we're gonna mute you. There you go.
Okay. That was the first, actually. I haven't had someone, I mean, they're online, she's online, so it's okay, right? We wanted you to answer. Oh, that was-
I technically just did a moment ago. I watched it.
Oh,
Sorry.
that's kosher.
It's okay.
Cool thing, no worries. Okay, so what is being, when we talk about all forms of Exodus, including the form of the Torah, the original form, as a representation, then we have to ask, what is it that's being represented? What's being represented? And before you like puzzle out this particular image, what do you think it is that when I call Exodus and the Torah a representation, what does that mean?
A representation of some sort of actual historical event.
Exactly. Yeah, so I don't know if I opened that up before. I'm obvious.
Takes the place of or could substitute for?
Oh,
I'm sorry, is there an online question?
Faith had a comment.
Sure, Faith, go for it.
I said, takes the place of or could substitute for.
Yeah, I mean, because obviously we are not enslaved in Egypt, right? And yet we utilize this story, and so it takes the place of whatever, like Genevieve said, whatever events that that happen that we can sort of identify with or that resonate. This is incidentally, I'm jumping ahead a few slides here, but this is the reason why Exodus is so resonant for African American Christians, right? Because they have a direct, sometimes within living memory of someone who had a direct experience with slavery itself, right? So that's not to say that someone is, I should clarify what I said. There are people who are still alive who knew people who were enslaved. That's what I mean by that. And so that's why, that's what the resonance is there for that particular community. But yeah, so there is something happened. I think I said to you last week that there is no actual evidence, as far as I know, as far as most scholars know, unless something happened today. There is no evidence of the Exodus, no scientific evidence, no archaeological evidence, no historic evidence of the events as they are portrayed in the book of Exodus in the Torah. And yet, this myth has incredible emotional power, cultural power, and something must have happened to set something in motion. And that's what we'll talk about pretty much today. Daryl, here you go.
I have sort of a question for you. She's probably a little better at history than me, except for 1930s, 1950s. Which we're talking about. No, I seem to recall ancient history. It's that period of time. There's probably virtually no facts on it, unless somebody runs into an ark in the ground that's buried or something. But just little bits and pieces. It sounded like this story didn't come out of whole cloth. Somebody had some experience in something and then told the story.
Yeah, absolutely. There are historic kernels of truth, or rather historic context that we can draw information from to try to figure out why the story takes the form it does, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So yes, absolutely. When I say that there is not evidence for the events of the Exodus, I mean there is no evidence of like large encampments of thousands of people on the shores of the sea or things like that. Every so often, you'll see someone oftentimes it's usually like a Christian apologist, trying to find evidence for biblical literacy. And they'll say, I died in the Red Sea. I went scuba diving, off of the lot, right? And while I was there, I found an Egyptian chariot wheel. They'll say things like that. But among mainstream scholars, there is no evidence for it. And again, I want to just sort of reiterate, that doesn't mean that this is not an important text. It is a critically important text. In many ways, I would say more important than if it were, historically verifiable. John, here you go.
That actually kind of reminded me of, about a year ago or so, I attended a lecture by Dr. Israel Finkelstein, the leading biblical archaeologist in Israel. Well, actually, I think the world, actually. But I briefly talked to him in contrasting his work at Har Megiddo with this archaeologist at Shiloh, who the archaeologist is very clearly evangelical Christian, and he was digging at Shiloh, and found some fascinating discoveries that line up around with what the time period of what Joshua's conquest would have been, and like what clearly shows the emergence of Israelite culture as a separate from. But Dr. Finkelstein agreed with me when I said that it seemed like that archaeologist was going and looking at, taking the Torah as a guide map, or the Tanakh as a guide map for what he's looking for, as opposed to finding stuff and coming with conclusions off of it.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. This is like, this individual is an intelligent scholar. They're still, I think, doing scholarship the wrong way, but they're still an intelligent scholar. When I was in graduate school, some friends and colleagues of mine, went up to Mount Shasta one of my colleagues was doing research on like theosophical societies in Shasta. And we just happened to stumble into an evangelical coffee house. It was like the one evangelical spot in this very new age town. And we got to talking with some folks there, and there was this gentleman who claimed to be an archaeologist, although he wasn't affiliated with the university. He said, though he had been at some point, and he said that he had discovered Joseph's tomb, which is in Egypt, which is fascinating because Joseph was taken, bones were taken out during the Exodus. I don't know how this guy accounted for that. I don't recall at the time. But when he was asked, not by me, by a buddy, but how he knew that it was Joseph's tomb, this guy, and this is very different from the scholarly individual, this dude straight up said, because the Egyptian figure on the wall had a large nose. Like straight up said that.
There's never been an Egyptian with a large nose in history.
Right. So that's not, I wanted to tell you, I thought that was a funny story. I mean, maybe it's not that funny in this day and age, but it was certainly funny at the time. Yeah, it is. So speaking of Egyptian wall paintings, that depict Semites, right? That depict people from the Levant, they depict Levantines.
Yeah, they don't have particularly large.
I know they don't. I don't know what this guy. If there is a depiction of the Joseph narrative, or anything close to it, maybe that's why I sort of subconsciously was jumping off of that. This image, the Ibsha relief, it's called. This would be it, right? So what is happening in this particular image? This is believed to be Levantine, Semitic, somewhere in the Levant, meaning Israel, Syria, possibly in parts of modern day Arabia, traders from that region who are coming to Egypt and engaging in economic activity, right? That's all that this is depicting. Yes, those are goats. Yeah, I believe they are. I'm not an Egyptologist, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing, I'm deducing that they're goats, yes. Anyway, but I don't know for sure. But anyway, so we know that there is interaction. There even is a period where there's a group of people called the Hyksos or Hyksos who are, like conquerors who conquer Egypt and rule as pharaohs for a while, and they are rumored to come from Levantine stock, to come from the Levant. And so that is one of the first sort of hints that there is some sort of interaction between those people in the land of Canaan and the empire, essentially, of Egypt. And this particular wall painting depicts that. And we can kind of, if we squint, see echoes of the Joseph narrative. Because at the end of the day, what are the Israelites, or rather that way, the Hebrews, what are they coming to Egypt for, if not to engage in a type of economic exchange, meaning we're starving and we need something, we're trying to escape this famine, but that is still an economic act, right? So there is that type of, I don't know that this is the historic ontological origin of the Joseph story, but we do know that there is interaction between these groups, right? So that's why I put that up there. Now, is this a representation of the Exodus? No, I would say not, but I would say that it's going to be a lot of these different historic things that we can pull from. I mean, they may cobble together what the original Exodus might actually have been.
I know that like the earliest proto-Canaanite inscriptions in like parts of eastern Egypt and stuff too.
Yeah, John just said they found proto-Canaanite inscriptions in eastern Egypt. So using Canaanite script, right? Which sometimes is referred to as like Proto-Canaanite, right? That's what it's referred to. Yeah.
Like right before Paleo-Hebrew.
Yeah, right before Paleo-Hebrew. Okay, so to understand this, we have to look at the historic context of what is happening in the Near East and the Mediterranean in general during the period that the Exodus is supposed to have taken place. And the Exodus, you remember, because even though it's a myth, we can date it historically. We can say that according to how the dates line up in the Torah, and according to like how Jews have studied it for generations, we would place the Exodus at approximately 14 to 1200 BC, give or take. So this takes place then around the time that historians refer to as the Bronze Age collapse. Now, again, bear with me because I am not a scholar of history, but I do find this to be particularly fascinating, and I hope you will as well. So what happens in have any of you heard of the Bronze Age collapse before? You want to Jen, you want to talk about it a little bit? Okay. You don't have to, I can talk about it.
Do you know?
I'll talk about it. Okay, I'm not trying to absolve myself of responsibility here. The Bronze Age collapse it's not a sudden event. It used to be imagined to be a sudden event, but really this is a gradual, over a period of about 100 years, contraction of the power of three large empires that really controlled the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, during the Bronze Age, which is approximately 2400 BCE to this collapse of about 1200 BCE. And the empires that we're talking about the Mycenaean civilization, which is the Greek civilization that existed prior to what we would call classic Greece, like classic, classic Athens and that sort of thing. The Hittite civilization, which ruled in sort of Anatolia, and then Egypt, right? So during the Bronze Age, these civilizations are at their height. They're very, very powerful. They contest with one another, but also there are extensive trade routes that go throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, throughout Anatolia, which is now Turkey, throughout which is now Greece, Egypt, and then further east into both Media, which is now modern day Iran, and then further east into this Valley civilization, right? So very, very extensive, intricate trade routes. And then a series of things happen that sort of see the contraction of this. And there's a lot of scholarship about what it is that actually does this. Some scholars have said that it was the eruption of Santorini, which is one of the volcanoes in the Mediterranean that brings about the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. Others have said that it was disease in the Hittite Empire that brings about the end of the Hittites. And then other scholars have speculated that there's these invaders that attack along the eastern Mediterranean shore, who are referred to in literature at the time as the Sea People. By literature at the time, I mean Egyptian literature. So Egyptian scribes and Pharaonic scribes are writing about the Sea People who are coming from the Mediterranean Sea and are haranguing and harassing villages all up and down Egyptian areas of influence, which basically means this whole area, right? This is all Egyptian influenced areas. And these little spots are places where it was speculated that the Sea Peoples, whoever they were, and we don't really know who they were, there is speculation about who they are. There is actually a specific speculation about a group of people that are very well known to the Israelites, who are very prominent in the Bible, the Philistines, are pretty much assumed to be one of these Sea People groups, although they probably were not a homogeneous ethnicity. Whoever the Philistines were probably talking about a mix of various Canaanites, Greek peoples, Egyptian peoples. It was a very kind of Philistia was sort of a multicultural community, is what we would call it today, because it was really a community of people who were fleeing these various areas that were being affected by the Bronze Age collapse. Daryl, go ahead.
This reminds me of a CSP lecture a couple of years ago. They talked about exactly what you talked about. And the professor there, when he was queried which of these events or how to happen, he said most likely, that's his opinion, all these events happen. Yeah, which said any one or two of them wouldn't have brought down the society.
Yeah, that's actually what point I was coming to that actually. What probably contributed to the Bronze Age collapse was a combination of a bunch of pandemics that hit the Hittite Empire, the eruption of the volcano that really badly affected Greece or Mycenae, and then the refugees from that, and also there was Aramaean like civil unrest, sort of in more in Mesopotamia. All those things probably contribute to this contraction of trade and influence. And in this contraction of trade and influence, some very interesting geopolitical events happen in the Levant, I'll come to momentarily. But one more thing I want to say about the Bronze Age, or what comes before what happened before the collapse, is that all of our mythology pretty much takes place within the Bronze Age, prior to the collapse. Because we don't know what happened in the Bronze Age for the most part. We do have records of it. When it comes to the mythology, we don't have any, we cannot find physical evidence of it. Because what is written down in the Torah is written during the Iron Age, not during the Bronze Age. It's written 1,000 years later. They are by that point, by the time that the initial scribes who write these stories down will become the Torah, what they are writing is not from our modern perspective, history. It is already mythology. They are writing down their stories that are remembered from this time that happened before everything kind of fell apart. And I say fell apart, it wasn't like this giant apocalypse. It was a gradual contraction of interactions. All right, let's move forward. Any questions online?
Nope.
Okay.
I did have something on the previous slide, Sean. I just wondered, how did the Israelites or Hebrew people, how did they wind up in the promised land if there was no Exodus? There's no record of them. I don't even think there are any stelae, Stellai, of Egyptian origin that mention the Hebrews. And I've heard that in several classes. But how did our people wind up in the promised land?
Well, we will get there. We are getting there.
We're not there yet.
We will make it to the promised land.
Okay, I hope so.
There is a stele that mentions them. There are others as well. I just heard a podcast on another one, but it slips my mind at the moment. But the one that I want to talk about actually is this one, the Merneptah stele, right? Which is from approximately 1200 BCE. So pretty much around this time. And this is what's written in hieroglyphics.
It mentions the Hebrew people?
it says at the very bottom, so basically, one of the things that Near Eastern people love to do, it was a form of propaganda, was to talk about how powerful they were and how their gods or their kings could just lay waste to destroy everyone. So when we read the story of the book of Joshua about the various Canaanite tribes being utterly wiped out, or the Amalekites being wiped out, or whatever, it probably didn't happen. We don't have evidence of that happening, thankfully. But it was a type of propaganda. It was like, don't mess with us because our God is going to destroy all of you, or our Pharaoh is going to destroy all of you. And that's what this particular stela is as well. And these are Egyptians, right? This is the Pharaoh Merneptah had this commissioned, and during this Bronze Age collapse period, when he was fighting various Canaanite people, and that's important to remember. Why are Egyptians fighting Canaanites? There's a reason behind that. We'll come to that on the next slide. But I do want to say this is what's written during this battle or this campaign, that at least according from the Egyptian perspective, the Egyptians won. And so essentially, Merneptah is saying that everyone has bowed down, is prostrate to Merneptah, to the Egyptian army. Nobody can raise their hand. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to this part of the end. The Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ascalon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam has been made non-existent. And here's the important part, right? Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Peru has become a widow because of Egypt. Israel obviously was not laid waste, we know that, obviously. But Israel, and that's even by the biblical accounts, during this period, there was not yet an Israel. There was Israel, Jacob, the patriarch, but there wasn't this collective of people known as, if we take the biblical account at face value, known as Israel or the Israelites yet. They would be when they go to Mount Sinai, but at this point that hadn't happened. And yet, here is this Egyptian pharaoh who says Israel is laid waste. So who is Israel? Well, Israel is some tribe, from this pharaoh's perspective, who he was fighting in Canaan. And that should get us begin scratching our heads. So Faith, you ask, how did our people get to the promised land? How did they get to the land of Canaan? The hint here is that, well, at some point, at least at the time that we think the Exodus happened, they were already there, right? So that this is one of the sort of historic bits of history that we know there are like grains of truth, right, in this story. Not necessarily the plagues or parting the sea, but there is a group called Israel, right? This is a group of people who are existing actually before they should be in the biblical account, which is really interesting.
So we really don't have to eat matzah?
So we really don't have to eat matzah. You only have to eat matzah during the Seder. After that, you eat potatoes.
Okay.
No, so this is, I think you raise a good point, is if the story is not historically true, or historically, rather, I should say historically verifiable, if there's a historicity to it, then what do we do with this myth? We just stop? We just stop practicing doing the Seder and celebrating Passover? And I would say, like, of course not, for a couple of reasons. One, it behooves us to find deeper meaning. Not just, this is what our ancestors did in the land of Egypt, but what have our ancestors done from then on, right, since then, and utilize this myth in our understanding. Also, thinking of myths as literal, as being like a literal thing, this literally happened, this is a very recent way of approaching biblical narratives. This is something that comes out specifically within the past 150 years, give or take. And it's an American thing, actually. It's an American Christian thing. And so there's a movement in the United States in approximately 1850 in direct reaction to the publication of Origin of Species that gives rise to fundamentalism in America and the idea that the biblical account is 100% historically factual and inerrant, right? Meaning God wrote it or inspired it, and that is the way it is, and it's completely true. It is fundamentally true. That is not an ancient way of looking at things. That is a recent American way of looking at things. Okay, Luther said, no, Alexis asked even going back to Luther. So Luther has an idea that he develops called sola scriptura and sola fide, scripture alone and faith alone, meaning that you use your faith to understand scripture. And he was certainly more literalist than his earlier Catholic counterparts would have been, or that his rabbinic counterparts would have been. But was he as literalist as the mid-19th century and early 20th century American fundamentalists? No, absolutely.
So it really is.
Yes, fundamentalism is an American thing. But this way, and this is the reason I bring this up, is because this way of thinking about whether or not this stuff actually happened, is it historically true? Can we prove it or not? And if we can't prove it, then it's nonsense. But we need to believe it's true for it not to be nonsense. That is an American way of thinking, right? And so, and then that's why I read it. That's why I sort of went off on that little tangent. Right? Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So, if it's not true, if the Israelites did not go from Egypt, wander the desert, enter into the promised land without Moses, and conquer the Canaanites, then who were they? And also, who were the Canaanites? Like, who are these people that we're talking about? So, according to the traditional narrative, I just sort of mentioned that the Israelites finished their wandering. They under the leadership of Joshua, and later these other judges, they go in the books of Joshua and Judges, the next part of the Tanakh, right after the Torah. They enter into the region and they engage in a various campaign, a war campaign against cities throughout Canaan. They conquered cities, and this is what they will be doing basically for the next few hundred years. And this is an ongoing conflict throughout the Bible, even later on, right? As the Israelites have kind of like taken control of this particular region, they will still war with other Canaanites and similar people like the Moabites and the Edomites and folks like that. Oftentimes, because the biblical writers are trying to say these other groups of people, we don't want to be like them, and the Israelites become too much like them. Oftentimes, it's done through the voices of the prophet, and that's why the Israelites end up going to war. But in the books of Joshua and Judges, it's in order to take control of the land. And this is how we understand it. God gives the land to the Israelites have to take control of it. This is the traditional narrative. And it really feeds how the biblical writers understand their place. But again, keep in mind that the biblical writers are writing a type of propaganda. They're trying to say that they are separate from everyone else and better than everyone else. Not better in the sense today, like I'm a better person, but in the sense that any tribe or group of people during that time frame, in their writings, they're all talking about how amazing they are and how their God is going to be more powerful than the next God and the next tribe's God. And that's the lens we want to sort of be looking at when we look at the historical origins of these texts. Questions? I always like to ask when we do some deep history. All right. Who are the Canaanites? Who are the Israelites? Well, scholars increasingly are coming to see, and I say increasingly, it's not increasingly, most biblical scholars kind of view it this way now. The Israelites were Canaanites. Yeah, the Israelites are Canaanites. They were Canaanites. They are Canaanites. I'm sure in the midst of this really difficult time we find ourselves in, you have encountered people online who have argued one way or the other about whether or not the Jews are quote unquote indigenous to this land. And I'm not going down this route right now, and I'm sure you've encountered this over the past month. This argument is ultimately tied to this very, very, very ancient history on were the ancestors of the Jewish people originally from the Levant or not. Historically speaking, archaeologically speaking, and genetically speaking. Yes, they were, right? And that contradicts the biblical narrative. That's important to remember. This contradicts our Torah by our biblical Torah narrative. All of the science contradicts that. But in order to contradict that, draws a connection to this land. Now that's all I'm going to say about indigeneity. Like I'm not going down that road tonight, but I just wanted to sort of put that out there. Okay, so I put here the geopolitical situation. Israelites or Canaanites. what is their geopolitical situation like during the late Bronze Age, and then into the Bronze Age collapse as we enter into the Iron Age. Well, let me go back a couple slides. So, Mycenaean civilization, the Hittite Empire, Egypt, and Hittites and Egyptians are constantly fighting over this little swath of land. Who's ever heard of that happening before, right? Why are they fighting over this little swath of land? Because this little swath of land has ports that go into the rest of the Mediterranean and has trade routes that go up and down between Egypt and the Hittites, and have trade routes that go into Mesopotamia and further east into the Indus Valley civilization, right? So this is a very important crossroads, and it is being fought over by larger empires for 3,000 years. And that's still happening today. It is not uncommon for people to look at the situation today and say that this is a contestation, not just between Israel and Hamas, but also between the United States and Iran, or United States and Russia, right? And other actors in the region. And we can look at that every time there's a conflict. And so this is happening 3,400 years ago. All right. So let me go forward again. So there's this contestation that's happening. And depending on jump ahead. Depending on the given time frame, different rulers are going to rule over Canaan. Sometimes it will be the Hittites, sometimes it will be the Egyptians. Usually it's one of those two. Fast forward 500, 600, 700 years, it's Babylon or Egypt or Assyrian, right? The same thing. You keep going forward until is the US and Russia, right? I'm not saying that we're fighting Russia over the land, but we're testing that basically. So that's the geopolitical situation. And when the Egyptians and the Hittites rule in this region, they are not nice to live under. They are monarchs, right? They are corrupt. They exploit people. They create very stratified and difficult social structure, especially if you're on the bottom of that social structure. It is not a pleasant experience if you are a Canaanite who is not royal or powerful in some way. These are very, very strict, almost caste structures that exist in Canaan at that time, both under the Hittites and under the Egyptians. So this is the situation that the Canaanites find themselves in. Now, other bits of evidence that the Israelites are Canaanites. Well, we see this in the religious culture. We see this in the names of the deities. So, and I put positive and negative in the sense that, like, the biblical lens looks at these different names through positive and negative lenses. Although the biblical writers have a reason for doing that. They're trying to make the Israelites gods and deities seem more important, right, than or better than the other ones. So names like El or Elohim or El Elyon, these names for God are names that are shared. We see them also in Moabite texts and Edomite texts. And we also see these names in Sumerian texts, right? El was a Sumerian sky deity, right? So, God. It just means God. But it was seen as like the main god of the Sumerian pantheon. But this Sumerian god will be picked up by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians, and it will eventually make its way down into the Levant. It will also eventually make its way down into the Arabian Peninsula, and the god will be known as Allah, right? Which is the same name, means God or the God, essentially. But also these negative gods, Baal, Moloch, Baal-zebub, right? These are also gods that are looked upon negatively by the Israelites. And the Israelite prophets are always saying, you shouldn't be following gods, because the reality is that the Israelites weren't following these other gods. The Israelites were following these other gods because the Israelites were Canaanites, Canaanite gods. John, go ahead.
Oh, another name you neglected to mention there is like Adon and Adonai,
Yeah.
too, where you see also that particular deity go to Greece with Adonis. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and so polytheistic structures are very interchangeable. And you see these, it's very easy to, like, if I would give an offering, if I'm a sailor and I give an offering to a a Canaanite, sailor, and I put an offering to like, to not go down in the seas. And he put off to Dagon, right, who was or Dagon, who's like the Canaanite sea god. And then I make it to Greece, and I'm like, I made it. I did this. I say to my counterparts, I gave an offering to Dagon, right? They're like, oh yeah, you should give an offering to Poseidon, because they have these same sort of figures. And so polytheistic traditions have this ability to be sort of like, to be interchangeable in that way. And so we see this in the Bible. We see this with names El Elohim, El Elyon, Baal, Moloch, Baal Zebub. These are names of gods and goddesses who the Israelites worshipped. But the priestly caste of Israelites, those who were most likely trying to write much of the Torah, did not want these gods to be worshipped. And especially during exile and after, as they encountered Zoroastrianism or trying to generate sort of a monotheism, they were trying to make these gods seem problematic. Nevertheless, from a historical perspective, we know that these gods and goddesses are shared by other Canaanite peoples, right? And in fact, this is a depiction of El. It is a Canaanite depiction of El, of the figure who we call God. Right? I know that. And it's an idol, right?
It's so little. Is it, it's little, right?
Yeah,
It's like a
little.
tiny one?
Yeah. I imagine you can see it in the British Museum. Anything from the Near East that's plundered is probably in London, so you can see that there. Right?
No.
We also see it with pottery. So if you look at pottery, in like parts of what were considered Moab and compare it to pottery in Judea, or you look at pottery in Lebanon and compare it to pottery in, around Jerusalem or something like that. Really from this period, the pottery is very similar. It is culture, and we know it's from the same culture.
The technology would be shared.
Oh, exactly. Technology would be shared. That's true.
Oh, touching upon what I was mentioning earlier with Shiloh, they also from roughly the time period, it's very clear through the archaeological record that Shiloh was a very important cultic site, but roughly around 1100 BCE or so, you start to see rapid shifts in the archaeological record. You start to see pig bones drop by 90% within the site. You start seeing stuff they found some altar stones too that follow the depiction of what an altar should look like in, I think, Exodus. Also, as well as you start seeing in some of the pits, only the right side of animals and stuff like that, which was the Levitical.
So this is in the beginning of the Iron Age.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, right after the collapse.
Yes. And I find that fascinating. This is happening during beginning and well into the Iron Age, where we see cultural depictions in the Bible, in the biblical accounts reflected in archaeology. Not just, oh, this is the city of David and this coin has David's name on it. No, that what is more significant is that, like John was talking about, that there are cultural similarities, and not just in Jerusalem, but also in places that were not necessarily we're not necessarily we associate with Israelites.
I mean,
Joshua was associated with Shiloh.
I have a question. Do we have the equivalent in the information, not information about history, or recorded history, where there's some sort of point history where you can clearly say this is when recorded history really began? I know there are before where people scribe, but is there a point where you can successfully say there's a lot of recorded history?
So do you mean among just Israelites, or you mean anyone?
Really anyone, because I suspect it all at the same time. If you go back too far, you get these scroll, you get stuff that you really can't weigh, and then you get the and I'm talking before Gutenberg, I mean, way back when.
Yes, well,
when they start scribing.
so the question Daryl has, if you didn't catch it online, is there a point where we know recorded history began? And forgive me, I don't remember the exact, century here, I think it's approximately 3000 BCE. It takes place in Samaria, in Ur in particular, but also in Sumer, which are cities in modern day Iraq, or when they're not in Iraq anymore, they're ruins now. But this was a Sumerian area, ancient Mesopotamia. They essentially invented writing. It begins with just with a cuneiform, yes, but cuneiform starts with basically taking down tablets of goods. You know, this many barrels of beer, this many bushels of oats. You know, that's how it starts. And then about 1,000 years later, there's literature like king lists, accounts of court, and then 500 years after that, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. So yes, now what's happening with the Israelis, and some of what the Sumerians come up with makes its way into the Levant, it makes its way into Canaan. So the gods in particular, so El makes its way in. Sumerian itself is not a Semitic language, but the Assyrians, who keep Sumerian alive and keep the Sumerian traditions alive, they are a Semitic people. Their language will actually give rise to Aramaic, and so it's like that's how these cultures come into this region. Yeah. All right. And actually, yeah, so I just mentioned the languages. One thing I want to say about Hebrew, when I say most closely resembles these ancient languages, when you're looking at the other Canaanite languages, because it's not just the Jews who are writing everything down and everyone else was just like, you know, not literate. That wasn't the case at all. When you specifically look at the neighbors of the Israelites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites, not the Arameans, that eventually becomes the lingua franca. But among these other tribes, Moab, Edom, Ammon, their language is basically, right? If there are cultural differences, there are dialects of this West Semitic language, or what we sometimes refer to as Proto-Hebrew, or sometimes Biblical Hebrew. It's similar to what's in the Torah. Yeah. There are different phrases, slightly different grammar. For the most part, we're talking about the differences between like a Southern Texas dialect and a Midwestern dialect. That's how close these languages are. Okay, so Alexis asked how similar is modern Hebrew to biblical Hebrew. I actually can't really quantify that, but Jenny, can you quantify that? I know you took a class on your Hebrew background is on biblical Hebrew, right?
It's not very similar.
Okay. Jenna says it's not very similar.
Modern Hebrew has
You want
modern Hebrew has some roots similar to biblical Hebrew, and if you can read and speak biblical Hebrew, you can awkwardly converse with modern Israelis on like a basic rudimentary level, but they will laugh at you frequently for the turns of phrase. It's like Old English versus New English, right? And so
Well, Old English you can't.
Yeah, you can.
right, right. Sorry, Middle English. Yeah.
Yeah,
So like it's like one step removed from what the heck are you talking about, basically. So there are similar words, but when the modern Hebrew language was created, they actually looked more at English and more at Spanish and other languages. They didn't really look as much at the biblical Hebrew when they were like creating a lot of modern.
Used as like a lexicon, basically.
Yeah, they used it as
What was the
1890.
maybe I can't like 1800s probably, but the
late 19th century.
yeah I can look that up. There's a dude. He's like the father of the modern Hebrew language, and you can look it up for sure. Ask check who's the father of the modern Hebrew language. I don't know because I studied with so I would sound stupid in Israel is the moral of the story.
His name's like right on the tip of my tongue.
yeah.
Yeah, Alexis is gonna find it, and I'm gonna kick myself for not remembering.
Yeah.
I wanted to say it's the late 19th century. It coincides with the Zionism. Yeah, it's Ben Yehuda. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Okay.
Like an A today.
You get an A. Well done. You get a gold star. All right. How come I can never get this to go
I'll
forward?
help you. I got you.
All right. So what are the ramifications if this is true? And it is true. I mean, spoiler alert, it's true. I think it's true. You know, I was once at a Seder that was put on by one of Jenna's like Orthodox friends, and this woman's husband was they were moderate Orthodox. They were like bordering on heredity, right? They were very strict Orthodox. And we was hosting the Seder for like, it wasn't Chabad, it was like another group, but it was the same sort of thing of having a bunch of students come in. We had just been dating. And he asked some question, what was it? He said, why do we eat matzah, right? And I just started graduate school, and I had some clever, and I probably wasn't wrong. I think it was based on like, you know, like sort of purity culture, like differences between communities or very tough stuff, sociological ideas. I had some clever comments. I don't remember what it was exactly. And you said them? I said it, yeah. And he slammed his hand down on the table. And he says, no, it's because God said go eat bread. And that was that stuck with me, clearly. So for him, though, she's still married. You know, if you hadn't, you would have wound up with like someone that like, what was that, Aish? Or what was it? Yeah, set you up with, right?
Jam, thank you very
Jam,
much.
okay. You would
Same idea.
be like some like Orthodox brothers.
Very different life. Continue.
I hate to think where I would. Single, yeah.
Sorry.
Single at best, right? That's the best thing. Anyway, so for this individual, and I didn't understand this time at the time of Texas. Right? That's what I was thinking. But as I sort of went through my graduate career, I didn't understand that like what most people believe are things I don't believe. Even things that are reasonable, there's many of those beliefs I don't believe. And reality is that this is what other people believe, and there's different ways of believing stuff. So when I say it's an invented history, I don't mean that it's fiction. I don't mean that it's not true. I don't mean that we should reject it and say, oh, look, this is nonsense. Why are we doing this stupid religious stuff? That's not what I mean. I mean that for me, I have to find another way to access these ideas. And for me, and I've had this conversation with Jenna before about what is it about the Jewish tradition that we connect with? And for me, it's this. Hey, John, are you trying to say something? Am I put it down? Dr. Sagan? No, so for me, like the main, what it is the historical truth of it, which is maybe examples of the Exodus, but there is still this lineage that goes back thousands of years, rich cultural and archaeological history that is in accessing that spiritual for me. And so when I participate in the Seder, no, I don't believe that that's what really happened. But for me, that's even more spiritual than we can happen. So yes, Carol.
John?
Question in general, you can answer, not answer, or whatever, but I, being a Reformed Jew and not being
Faith
exposed to a
wants
bunch
the question.
of Orthodox founders, I've never been asked whether I believe whether the Exodus is true. I just never worried about it.
John?
So 1 second, let me just answer this question. I'll come back to you, Faith. I know you're waiting to ask, and I have not forgotten.
It's okay.
To answer your question, I mean, I don't think you were going to like college Shabbat dinners that were put forth by like Aish and Chabad and all of them. If you go to an Aish or a Chabad, or even some more like intense Hillel Shabbat dinners as a college student, you'll encounter this. So there is a cultural context there. Okay, Faith, go ahead.
I was just going to say you're in very excellent company, Sean. I don't know if you've ever heard of Rabbi David Wolpe.
Of
From
course.
Yeah, well, how many years ago did he come out with the theory of no Exodus? But what he did say was what came out of it, our teachings, our commandments, if you will, our biblical teachings, all of that has relevance.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether they flew to Canaan or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
You know, it's just the pictorial helps to enforce the real, you know.
The representation is what makes it real. The realness is in the storytelling, which is that when you harken back to the first couple of slides, and we talk about myth in general.
I think he was roundly condemned too, but
Yeah, I know, I think he was, and what I'm saying right now, if I were to like post what I'm saying on Reddit, there would be a whole bunch of angry Orthodox folks. That come out of this. There's one in particular, this guy named Spinoza was wrong. Every time I post something, he comes after me. You know you're in good company when someone named Spinoza was wrong comes after you. Anyway,
What did you say? When what?
I said there's someone online whose handle is Spinoza was wrong, meaning like.
Oh, okay.
He every time I post something, he like goes after me.
Yeah.
Anyway, so let me, I've gone a little bit of far afield here. What is, so this is not true, like, first of all, what is true? What is true is that it seems increasingly likely that the Israelites were a tribe of Canaanites who escaped the sort of thraldom of Hittite and Egyptian control, not through an exodus, but through like a social uprising, went and hid in the Judean foothills and formed a new type of society. And that new society is reflected in the writings of the Torah that's passed down orally until the Iron Age, when writing sort of comes back and these scribes are able to put it down. And that is a really, really cool idea. I mean, not just an idea, that looks like it's the way it happened. And that's really, really, that resonates for me very deeply on an emotional and even spiritual level. But also, like Faith said, when she referred to Rabbi David Wolpe, it is also real in our cultural reality and in the cultural realities of other people who utilize the Exodus myth to understand who they are, who utilize it in an ethnologic sort of way. So what is real about it, in addition to this history or the historical elements that do have that we can sort of date or quantify, the narrative reflects our own cultural reality and our self-conception. Our cultural reality of our ancestors having been through the exile, our cultural reality of what happens with the Roman destruction, our cultural reality of all wanderings since then, our cultural reality of the Inquisition, our cultural reality of coming to America, which everyone who comes to America tapped the Exodus, not just us. And we just sort of went along with that. It was already there. Or I should say everyone who comes to or is brought taps into the Exodus. And that's what makes it so powerful, is our lived experience. Also the idea of being a holy people, or seeing ourselves as holy people that have responsibilities to bring light into the world, or at least that's how in our perfect self-conception, that's what we would like to do. I don't know if we always do that, but that's what we would like to do. That is also, that's the culmination of the Exodus, and that's part of this story too. And I'm going to, Daryl, I believe the last one.
You know, if you bring up this in a sense, if you think about all the Jews that do good things and don't believe in God, basically that's what's happened.
Yeah.
Exactly what is happening. And I kind of wish a lot of those Jews would still enjoy these stories and not call them nonsense, even if they don't believe them. And this is not just true about the Jews, this is true of my students, or like, it's all a fairy tale. Like, that's not, no, it's not. It's fairy tales are also myths, they serve a purpose. You know? So anyway, I will keep us, I think we're at the end of our time, right? I will leave it with that. I think we've pretty much gotten through this ancient history stuff. We will come back, not next week, but the following week, where we will talk about American Exodus, which is really quote William, that's where I'm like.
Okay, could you repeat that, Sean? No class next week?
No class next week because it is Thanksgiving.
And then after that, we're going to discuss what?
American Exodus. So how did
Thank you.
Aha, right? For real.
Thank you.
They see themselves as the Israelites, and how have other people in America see themselves as the Israelites.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
welcome.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. And happy birthday, Shannon. All right, bye y'all.
Bye. See you Friday.
Thank you. If you want, come to my class on Thursday.
Oh, sure, I should have.
It's okay. We have music class on Thursday. In person and on Zoom.
Yes.